The Seattle Seahawks have been one of the most busy teams this offseason so far, replacing guys like Geno Smith, DK Metcalf, and so many other key starters. So in this video, I want to talk about the Seattle Seahawks and why I actually think the Seahawks are in a better position now than they were last year. Subscribe if you're new, let's hop into it. So obviously, I don't really think I have to recap what the Seahawks have done so far. They have been one of the most busy teams in the offseason, again, replacing Geno Smith with Sam Darnold, replacing DK Metcalf with Cooper Kupp, removing a couple pieces here and there like Tyler Lockett and so on and so forth. And man, this team looks like a completely different roster. Obviously, new head coach from last year. Basically, it feels like a brand new roster with so many new pieces. And I think this team is honestly heading in the right direction. Now, I think I want to start this video off by discussing the quarterback switch from Geno Smith to Sam Darnold, because that's probably the most controversial point of the offseason. Now, let me get this very clear and very obvious here. I do think that Geno Smith is a fantastic quarterback, and I think that Geno Smith arguably is a better quarterback right now than Sam Darnold. But Sam Darnold is a younger quarterback who's also probably going to be on a cheaper deal once Geno Smith actually does get paid. So I think it was probably the right move to make, because you probably weren't going to be contending with Geno Smith if you kept DK Metcalf. If you just kept running back the exact same roster year in and year out, they wouldn't have the flexibility to really make too many game-changing moves, which they can now do because of the Sam Darnold move. If you have Sam Darnold, who's younger, going to likely be a little bit cheaper, and you get rid of DK Metcalf, who also wanted a new contract, you have a little bit more financial flexibility to really surround Darnold with the right pieces around him. Now, going back to Darnold here, I do think that Darnold is not as good as Geno Smith. I don't think that Darnold can elevate a roster like Geno Smith can, but again, he's younger quarterback, he can still develop, can still grow, and I think now that this team has more money available for them in the future years, they're going to be able to surround Sam Darnold with a capable enough roster, primarily an offensive line with some new receivers, so on and so forth, which they really couldn't do with Geno Smith. You see, if they signed back Geno, if they signed back DK Metcalf, they really weren't going to have the financial flexibility to really address some of their key issues unless it was through the NFL draft. But now that you've gotten rid of Geno and you've gotten rid of DK, you have a little bit more flexibility to actually go out there and be aggressive in free agency, as we saw with them bringing in Cooper Kupp. Sam Darnold, to me, is a fine quarterback, but at the same time, I don't think that he could elevate a roster, like I said, like Geno Smith can. I think he needs a good roster around him to be successful. Obviously, last year with Minnesota, he had a really talented roster with guys like Aaron Jones, Jordan Addison, Justin Jefferson, some good tackles on that offensive line. Obviously, the season didn't go as they wanted it to because they had some glaring issues, but that was still a roster that was very talented on the offensive end, and I would say it's probably a little bit more talented than this offense. So there is going to be a bit of a obstacle for Sam Darnold to overcome, a roster that isn't as good as that Vikings roster, but I still do think that Sam Darnold is very capable and can get this team going in the right direction. When you look at the personnel around Sam Darnold, you obviously have two very good running backs in Charbonnet and Kenneth Walker. Both those guys, I think, are good running backs. They just haven't quite had the offensive line to, really be all that successful. When you look at the receiving core, you replace DK Metcalf with Valdez-Scantling and now Cooper Kupp, and I gotta be honest with you, I think I'm very excited and very optimistic about what this receiving core can be, because it's something that we haven't ever really seen from the Seattle team, at least over the past couple years. You see, the traditional way of having a three receiver set is you have one guy who primarily works in the slot, one guy who is your burner downfield who can open up the field for you guys, and then one guy who could be your outside receiver who makes big splashy plays. You had JSN play more in the slot, you had DK Metcalf make more of those big plays, and then you had Tyler Lockett, who's somebody who could stretch the field vertically and create space for JSN and DK Metcalf. But now that's not really what they have. They have JSN, who's going to primarily probably play within the slot, but then you also have Cooper Kupp, who also does a lot of his work underneath and also in the slot. Then you have Marquez Valdez-Scantling, who's going to be the guy who helps create separation, can create some spacing for this offense to function, because he's going to hypothetically take over the role of like a Tyler Lockett, but have more size to him. So you have two guys in JSN and Cooper Kupp who absolutely dominate in the underneath stuff. They just absolutely destroy linebackers. They destroy safeties. They can destroy slot corners. Any type of those style cornerbacks, those guys can just absolutely dominate them in the short to intermediate range. And again, there isn't really any roster that I can think of that has those type of guys. The only one that I can really think of that has two guys who can just completely destroy any cornerback in the underneath area is like Kansas City with Kelsey in his prime Prime and Rashee Rice, where both those guys are just really good masters of creating space, creating separation, running crisp routes. I think Seattle has two guys who, when healthy, are better than at this stage Kelsey and Rashee Rice. Like JSN is a fantastic receiver, got over 1,000 yards last year. It looks like he's ready to take the next step. Cooper Kupp, when healthy, we all know who he can be. Both these guys, they understand leverage. They know how to get separation. They know how to be sure-handed, be ready options for their young quarterback. And I think for Sam Darnold, you're going to have two guys who are going to consistently get constant separation and constant space for him to work with. I mean, it's going to be very difficult for defenses to manage all those underneath routes while also having to worry about Noah Fant, on a seam, or Marquez Valdes-Scantling going deep, so on and so forth. It's going to be really difficult, especially for teams that don't have the personnel to match up well with JSN and Cooper Kupp, who again are just going to dominate in the short to intermediates. Now, I want to talk a bit about this offense in terms of a negative light, because I don't think this offense is quite yet ready to take that next step unless they make a few more moves this free agency or in this draft. I look at the offensive line and they really haven't addressed the offensive line too much. So I think this offensive line could be a source of concern for this team moving forward. Obviously, Charles Cross at tackle, you feel pretty confident in, but Abraham Lucas consistently cannot stay healthy. Then your interior of your offensive line is very, very suspect. So if you are the Seahawks, I do think addressing a offensive lineman in this year's draft needs to be priority number one, because you want to keep your younger quarterback in Sam Darnold available and ready to go. Because again, with JSN and Cooper Kupp being not necessarily deep threats, this team is going to have to stay on schedule. They're going to have to stay in a rhythm. And if a sack happens against Sam Darnold and they get behind the line of scrimmage and it's now like 2nd and 15, I just have a hard time imagining this offense really making big plays downfield, which could be a big time issue for this team. Which then that brings me back to another need that I think this offense could really use. I think this offense could use a DK Metcalf-like guy. Now, I'm not saying they need to go back and try to get DK Metcalf, but in the second round, I would really like to see this team take a long, physical, rangy, good length, good size receiver that can just kind of bail out Sam Darnold when things are breaking down. Again, let's just say in a hypothetical situation, Darnold drops back and you have JSN and Cooper Kupp working the short to intermediate stuff. And let's just say JSN gets locked up and then Darnold is late to his read to Cooper Kupp. I think Darnold then needs a consistent outlet who he can just kind of throw the ball up to and see if he can make a play. Because right now, they really don't have that guy. I mean, hypothetically, I guess you could try that with Noah Fant, but I don't know if that's necessarily a realistic possibility. And fortunately for them, there are a couple of second-round receivers that I think could be potential options for that type of guy. Somebody like an Alec Ayamanor or like a Savion Williams, I think could be a really solid fit for this team. Just guys who are long, wiry, lengthy, and could just win a couple contested catches here and there. I think that would really do this offense some wonders, because they don't really have the size within their two star receivers right now. Now, if we flip over to the defense, I think this defense is really ready to take a big breakout year. Obviously, you bring in Mike Macdonald last year, who had a great defense with the Ravens, and I thought last year this defense showed flashes, but it definitely was not the defense that I'm sure Macdonald really wants to put out there on a daily basis. I look at this defensive line and man, it looks really solid right now. Jaron Reed, a developing Byron Murphy who should take a big step forward next year. DeMarcus Lawrence was your big ticket free agent so far, and then Leonard Williams. I think this defensive line is big, they're physical, they're long, lengthy, rangy. I think they can really cause some disruptions, not to mention Boy Mafe is also there. And then you bring back Ernest Jones, you have Tyrese Knight. I think you feel pretty good about your front seven in totality. This defense, realistically speaking, it needs to take that big step forward next year, because I don't know if this offense is going to be highly powered. Like, it's going to be a methodical offense that has to move the ball and chew up clock and run the football and, work the short to intermediate. So they're going to need their defense to, make some plays out there, because I don't think this offense is going to score 40 points a game and can consistently bail out their defense. So this defense has to take a step forward, and I think they have the pieces to do so. Again, their front seven on paper looks really good. And then your secondary, Von Witherspoon's a total superstar. Kobe Bryant looks really good down the stretch of the season. You have Julian Love. I think there's some question marks with your second corner and either Reek Woolen, Nehemiah Pritchett, Josh Jobe, those sort of guys. Like, there's some question marks about how those guys would play. Reek Woolen make a bunch of flashy plays here and there, but he consistently is inconsistent, if that makes sense. But again, it's not like it's a major replacement option right now. Maybe you draft a cornerback in round 3 if one happens to fall to you. But I do expect this defense to take a nice step forward in year number 2 under Mike Macdonald. Again, I didn't think their defense was particularly bad last year, but it also wasn't necessarily fantastic. So again, what are my thoughts of the Seattle Seahawks? I think they took took the right steps this offseason. I've seen a lot of people call this team big time losers at free agency, but I think they actually made the right decisions. Yes, Geno Smith is a better quarterback than Sam Darnold, but Darnold gives them more financial flexibility. He might be a better fit within the new system they have with their new offensive coordinator. It's going to allow this team to move around and make big time purchases like a Cooper Kupp or a DeMarcus Lawrence, and then eventually they'll be able to fix up the offensive line and add even more weapons around Sam Darnold. So while I do think that Geno Smith is a better quarterback than Sam Darnold, I think Darnold is a better long-term play, and I think Darnold is not that far away from being just as good as Geno Smith. Like, I don't think it's a huge drop-off like people are making it out to be. Like, Geno Smith is arguably maybe like a top 12, top 11 quarterback in the NFL. Darnold's like top 15, top 17, something along those lines. So yes, he's maybe not as good as Geno Smith, but he's probably going to be a lot cheaper. He's also a lot younger, and he better fits the timeline of your roster. You got younger, and you got, in my opinion, better. And yes, losing DK Metcalf sucks, but DK Metcalf, as good as he was again kind of like Rick Willen, consistently inconsistent, where sometimes he's just destroying teams and just looks unbelievable, and then other times he's really quiet, and that could be a product of the system, could be a product of quarterback play, but I think it's also a little bit to the fault of DK Metcalf. DK was also somebody who, I don't want to call him a diva because that's not, I don't think that's the right word for it, but at times, you know, could push the limits a little bit and make some boneheaded plays here and there and get himself, you know, in foul trouble, get himself ejected, so on and so forth. Not really going to have that with Cooper Kupp or JSN. Those guys are just, you know, professionals. They know how to get their job done. They know how to make big time plays. And I think again, going from DK Metcalf to Cooper Kupp could be considered a downgrade, but I just really find this fascinating to see how they're really going to make this work, because both those guys are very similar, but man, it's going to present a huge problem for defenses covering those intermediate and shorter routes. I mean, it's just going to be a nightmare because you're going to have two guys who just can open up so much space for Darnold. And again, if this offense can get in a rhythm, man, it's going to be tough to stop them. But that's the one thing that I will say. If you can get this offense out of rhythm, if you can create pressure on Darnold, that's going to present a big time issue. But again, I also want to say on the contrary to that, if you can get pressure on Sam Darnold, you're going to have two guys who are just going to be excellent hot reads in JSN and Cooper Kupp. So whenever there is pressure, you have two guys who are probably just going to be wide open. You can just toss it off to them. I do still think this offensive line is a source of problems for this team. I think they have to address that with the first round. And truth be told, I would really like to see this team maybe take a flyer on one more lineman in this year's free agency. They haven't quite yet done that. So if they can find some pieces to add to this offensive line, and if the offensive line can take a step forward next year, if just Abraham Lucas can just, for the love of God, just stay healthy, then I think this offense looks really good on paper. And I think this defense should also take a big step forward next year. So do I think this Seahawks team is going to take a step forward next year in terms of their actual record? I tend to think they actually will. Last year in the NFC West, obviously you didn't make the playoffs. You didn't really have the season that you wanted to. The season felt like you had a good couple stretches here and there, and then you had a couple bad stretches here and there. I think with this new team, you'll find more consistency. And with San Francisco looking like a shell of its former self, I don't know if Seattle's going to necessarily win the division, because I think the LA Rams look really intimidating, at least on paper. And then Arizona should also take another step forward next year. But I do think Seattle's going to be right in the mix for this division. Also, don't discount San Francisco. They can probably find their way back in the division. But I could see a theoretical world where all four of those teams are getting close to the 10+ win mark and really competing for this division. But I do think Seattle has positioned themselves in a fine position to go out there and make a playoff spot and, you know, cause some noise out there. Again, I want to reiterate, I think this receiving core is super talented. I think it's really solid, and I think it's going to cause a lot of issues for teams out there. And again, if they just if they can address a wide receiver 4, wide receiver 3 guy who can just, you know, be an outlet for Darnold when things break down, and I think this offense could be really nasty next year. So you guys let me know in the comment section below, what do you guys think of the Seattle Seahawks? Do you guys think they're ready to take that next step? Because I tend to think they actually will next year. Darnold's in, Geno's out, JSN takes a big step forward next year. Cooper Kupp is going to be nasty next to JSN. Let me know. Love you guys. Peace.